Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm just going to go through the major acronym that you need to do a much better job with your poetry. It's going to help you analyze the poems better, integrate context when you need to more clearly, and just come up with better ideas and better paragraphs at the end of the day. If you don't know who I am, my name's Adam, and I try to make you a little bit better at English every single video. So with that said, let's dive straight in. This study guide that I'm using is also going to be totally free of charge for you to download. There should be information about that in the description. So this is this idea of CARTWARS. As far as I'm aware, no one else teaches it quite like this. I have heard people talk about art wars before, and then the C on the top is really important as well. And I want you to understand that this is really split into two halves, okay? So this first half is actually going to be things that you need to deduce or work out from the second half. So we're actually going to start with the second half, the wars section. So I say you go to war with the poem, and then you can work out the cart of the poem afterwards. Okay. So in terms of the W, this stands for words, and that's obviously quite simple. You're looking for interesting words that might have some interesting kind of connotations or might convey certain interesting messages, especially if they're interesting kind of verbs or adjectives or things like that. So one of the most obvious things you need to be looking at as you read a poem is individual words and what connotations or ideas they could be creating. You then also need to look at all the other language devices. There's so many that I'm not going to name all of them here, but one of my favorite acronyms for this is called JAM-WINS, and I think that this covers a lot of the most important ones. So the J stands for juxtaposition, the A stands for alliteration, the M stands for metaphors, the W and the N are reminders for the words and particularly nouns and verbs and adverbs. The I is for imagery, and the S is for similes. Now, there are lots of other things you can look at. So with the J of juxtaposition, you might also connect the O of oxymoron, right? With the A of alliteration, you might also tag onto that things like sibilance and onomatopoeia, things to do with sound. With the M or S, the metaphor and the simile, you might also add another really important figurative language device, which is called personification. Or you might, with those, or with the I imagery, think about pathetic fallacy, which can be really important as well. So anyway, JAM-WINS, I think, is a great little acronym. And then any other techniques you see on top is just a bonus, really, okay? You want to be looking at the rhythm and the rhyme in the poems as well. If the poem has rhythm, it's most likely going to either be what's called iambic, which is where it goes weak, strong, da-dum, 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 or it's going to be trochaic, which is where it goes strong, weak, so dum, da-dum, 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 da. So it's either weak, strong, or strong, weak. And then there's pentameter, tetrameter, hexameter, all kinds of other things that I'm not going to go into in this quick video, but you need to be looking at rhythm. That can be really impressive to the examiner. And then in terms of rhyme, the main ones you need to be looking out for are things like couplets or what's called alternate rhyme. So you want to be looking out for if the poem is, you know, like A, B, B, C, C, D, D, that would be couplets, right, of A's and B's and C's and D's, or A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. That would be alternate because every other line alternately would rhyme, yeah? And this can have really interesting ideas as well, and help get you towards level 9. With the rhythm and rhyme and the structure, one of the big things you want to be trying to do is you want to be trying to link or show an interrelationship between something that the poet has done with rhyme, for example, and a word choice or a language device or something like that, and how together they work to create a deeper meaning in the poem. I'll give you a great example. Let's imagine that we have one of these power and conflict poems that we're about to dive into in this series, and the beginning of the poem, it's really rigidly like couplets, A, B, B, C, C, D, D, right? That might show the order of the army at the beginning of a battle, let's say. And then as the battle goes on, let's imagine that the rhyme disintegrates and we no longer have an A, B, B, or even an A, B, B. We have no rhyme suddenly. That might show how war brings out chaos. And then you could compare the way the rhyme changes with maybe a few images or words in the poem. Let's just take the word screaming. That word screaming might show the chaos and disorder that comes as the war goes on. And you might also look when the rhyme is intact at the beginning. Let's say a word like unity, right? So the word unity matched with the neat rhyme kind of creates together this idea of order. So hopefully you can see what I mean by that. Structure, there is this acronym again. I am the king of acronyms, if you don't know that by now, called SHLEPS. And in a nutshell, SHLEPS stands for stanzas. So look at the stanzas. How many? How long? Are they even? Are they uneven? C stands for caesura. So look and see if there are like pauses and breaks in the middle of lines of poetry and why that is. L stands for line lengths. Are the lengths of the lines physically on the page quite even, or does the poem look kind of scattered as you read it? E stands for enjambement. So does one line of poetry flow into the next without any punctuation? Or is there punctuation that sort of slows things down at the end of lines? That can be very significant in terms of pace. P stands for punctuation. Probably don't comment on just basic commas and full stops. But if there's interesting punctuation like semicolons, hyphens, dashes, ellipsis, question marks, exclamation marks, those are the kind of punctuations you might want to pick out and really focus in on. And then finally, this last S stands for sentence lengths. So or sentence forms. How long are the sentences? How long do you go between full stops? If the sentences are quite long and complex, that can be quite interesting in terms of pace. If the sentences are quite short and simple, that can also be really interesting in terms of pace. And just remember that long sentences creates faster pace usually, and short sentences create slower pace usually. So that's the wars section. And as you can see, once you've worked out and annotated all this on a poem, you're very likely going to be able to work out the top section. So context is the one bit that you won't be able to work out from wars. And really, there are two major things you need to think about. You need to think about the reader, and you need to think about the actual context, or what we might call the history of when the poem was written, okay? So in terms of reader response, you can talk about how you feel about, or what you think about the poem based on your contemporary reading here in modern times, or you might comment on how the reader of the time it was written, so let's say it's a Victorian poem, how the reader would have responded at that time to the poem based on their social, cultural identity, right? So there's two strands to this that you need to think about. The about section, in some ways, is also a two-step process. So there's often in these poems what we would call a surface level reading, what the poem is like, on just like what happens in the poem, the surface level. And then there's usually a deeper or more symbolic meaning. So I'll give you a quick example of that. The poem we'll look at next lesson would be Ozymandias. The surface level of that poem, it's just about these broken statues this guy finds in the middle of the Egyptian deserts. That's the surface level. The deeper meaning is it's a critique of the power structures of the past and how time and nature diminish and decay that power structure until there's nothing left. So you can see there's two very different meanings to that poem, right? And you ideally need to know both, but the one that's going to get you the most marks, of course, is going to be that deeper meaning and the symbolic meaning, stuff like that. You then have repeated ideas. This is really simple. I want you to think of this as just the themes and motifs that are within the poem. So all of these poems are going to be different versions of power or conflict or both, because it's called Power and Conflict, right? But there might be some poems that celebrate power and the way that power can be a good thing. And then there are going to maybe be poems that sort of look at how power can be abused and turned into dictatorships or tyranny, right? Same with conflict. There can be conflict that actually brings great results. I'm thinking things like Charge of the Light Brigade is quite positive of war and conflict. And then there'll be other poems that show the dark side of war, the PTSD, so the psychological damage of war, maybe the physical damage of war, the family breakdown from war. So the themes and ideas or themes and motifs are going to be very important, and you'll work out what the poem is trying to say based on the words, language, rhythm, rhyme, structure. And then finally, the tone. This is basically just the vibe or atmosphere that is created in the poem. And it can be more than one, right? For most of these poems, you're going to have quite a gloomy, pessimistic sort of tone, but you need to look at the way that the poem has been put together and work out what mood or atmosphere is created. If you do all of these bits of CARTWARS as you analyze poems, either through my videos or individually as well, it's going to help you so much to just do way better in your poetry section. And I want you to understand that you should be adding at least 6 or 7 of these 8 bits of CARTWARS into every poetry essay that you do, whether it's unseen poetry or a poetry anthology like The Power and Conflict. With unseen poetry, you probably don't have to do the context, so you could just do art wars. But yeah, hope that was useful, and I hope you enjoy the videos on the poems, and I'll see you in the next one.